Parker.
Yes, well, I won't make reference to who's the dummy around here, sir. I think it's pretty obvious that some people enjoyed a good dinner, though, before they came back to the House, given the mispronunciation of names that was prevalent in the early part of that speech. Mr Speaker, it's pretty clear that, as I said in my address on the first reading of this bill, that there's been a lot of brinksmanship around the Hobbit, that there was brinksmanship by the unions, there was brinksmanship by Warner Brothers, and there was brinksmanship by the government. And we all know that Warner Brothers plays a hard game. They did it when we were in government. They always tried to ratchet up the terms and conditions that they got so as to make their film enterprises more profitable. And they've done it again with the government. So what has happened here, according to Mr Tohenare, is that it cost nothing. Cost nothing was the phrase that he said. $34 million is the extra money that Warner Brothers have had out of the New Zealand taxpayer. $34 million extra. $34 million. Yeah, same amount as the extra money that went into the private school sector in the recent budget by the government. Mr Speaker, $34 million is what was at stake from Warner Brothers. It's a lot of money even to them, and they played a game of brinksmanship. It's true also that the union movement played a game of brinksmanship earlier. They pulled out by the 18th of October, and yet we've had the dishonesty of some parties to this debate asserting that the union movement was still holding a gun to the head of other parties involved in this after the 18th of October, when we have an email from Warner Brothers to another Warner Brothers person on the 18th of October, American time, showing that they knew that by then the threat that they perceived to be apparent from the union movement, which may have been overstated, but whatever threat they saw, they recognised by then had gone. And yet we have the government pretending after that date that that was the reason why they had to go to this step in respect of this changed law, which has been forced upon us. We heard Mr Henare also saying that what they're doing is making it clear that if you're a contractor, you're a contractor. If you're an employee, you're an employee. That's actually not what this legislation does. Phil Twyford described this legislation to me in his office before the dinner break as saying it formalises a fiction. It's actually a very good description of what happens here. It allows people to pretend that that an employment relationship is a contractual relationship, and even if it's an employment relationship, they'll call it a contractual one. It formalises a fiction. Now, why can this be important? Why can this be important? Because there are different rights and responsibilities depending on whether you have a contractual relationship or an employment relationship. If you're a contractor, you don't get holiday pay. You've got to pay your own tax. You're not entitled to the minimum wage. You're not entitled to sick pay. That's absolutely permissible under our system of law. I'm not criticising that. People can choose to have a contractual relationship rather than a relationship as employees. But the point is they can already do that at law, and we don't need to have this law which effectively formalises a fiction where you can, under this law, have an employment relationship, but it will be at law a contractual relationship without employee protections. And that's what this law does, and it's completely unnecessary because the law relating to contractual relationships is already clear, has been clear since the Supreme Court decision that was referred to in earlier speeches was delivered 5 years ago, and hasn't been problematic since. These organisations that are involved in this multi-$100 million enterprise have the very best of lawyers. They have the very best of systems. They can ensure already that they engage people through contracts as contractors rather than as employees. They do not need this legislation. The reality is that this legislation is a piece of political opportunism by the Prime Minister and the National Party their game of brinksmanship in respect of whether they would get Warner Brother over the line or not, which wasn't, I'm not blaming the government for all this brinksmanship. Warner Brothers always plays this game. They weren't sure that their $34 million that they eventually paid was going to get them here. They thought that they might lose this deal to Ireland or some other filmmaking country, and so they wanted someone else to blame. So despite the fact that the unions had already stopped their game of brinksmanship, despite the fact that the Labour Party has never been meaningfully involved in these negotiations, and indeed I can attest to that. I can remember talking to Trevor Mallard, who was saying to me it would be inappropriate for Labour to be stepping into this space because that was the role of government, and if he had been the minister, and he used to be the minister, and the National Party had involved themselves in those negotiations, then he would have thought that that was inappropriate, and that's why Trevor said we should stay out of these negotiations, and we did. So for the Prime Minister to assert that we are somehow complicit in trying to undermine the likelihood that The Hobbit would be filmed here is absolute rubbish. I want to deal with something that Rodney Hyde said. Rodney Hyde came down here and he said we were without principle. We were without principle. That little hobbit is the man who came to this Parliament and put David Garrett into the position of his law and order spokesperson after he'd taken a donation from the Sensible Censoring Trust, put him in that position knowing that he had used suppression of name to keep his conviction for stealing the identity of a young child for passport fraud. That sort of double standard is what I call a lack of principle. That's a lack of principle. So, Mr. Hyde, don't you come down here and talk about principle. And neither should the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister has described the dealings by Mr. Hyde of those issues as being well handled. That is a lack of principle from the Prime Minister. That is a lack of principle from ACT. So don't come here and lecture us about principle, because they are both unprincipled acts. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is unnecessary. I agree with those people who say that it's not all the National Party fault that they had to pay more money in order to secure the Warner films. I agree with that. We did it ourselves when in government. I would criticise the way they've done it, and that they're funding an individual enterprise rather than changing the criteria for major films that could be applied to other enterprises. That really is, to me, just interfering in an individual contract too directly rather than using a principled approach. But what about the Auckland Airport? Oh, no, actually what I did there was exercise the ministerial discretion, Paul Quinn. You obviously don't understand the difference. The National Party would, of course, approve the sale of Auckland Airport to overseas interests, just as they've allowed their tummy to be tickled by Warner Brothers and allowed our laws to be changed in New Zealand in respect of our labour laws as a consequence of this deal, and just as they've ticked off every land purchase sought by overseas owners since they took office. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is not necessary. It formalises a fiction. It formalises a fiction. We see that the Minister, with this rushed legislation, has already had to put a supplementary order paper on the table because actually she learned from what Charles Chauvel said in an earlier contribution, that Charles Chauvel was right, and I see the Minister nodding, and thank her for that acknowledgement that Charles was right on that point, and the law as drafted in this hastily put together piece of legislation wouldn't have even achieved the intent that the government wanted to achieve were it not for the supplementary order paper that the Minister has now put forward. We'll be voting against that as well, but no doubt the National Party with ACT and Maori Party support will ram it through under urgency, Mr. Speaker. Oh, now look, here we go. We've got the Muppets down here. We're actually debating The Hobbit, not the Muppets, and we've got those two elderly puppets on the back seat there, Toru Henry and Paul Quinn, just as sort of ill-informed as those elderly puppets in the Muppets. Can't quite hear what's going on, always get a bit confused, making inappropriate interjections. Mr. Speaker, this is bad law. This is bad law. It is bad law. It is unnecessary law. and it is driven by a political agenda on the part of the National Party, who were so close in their brinksmanship they wanted someone else to blame.